Welcome to session 3 of Video Bible College. We're looking at the book of Romans, and we're up to Paul's greeting where he talks and introduces himself, introduces his purpose of why he's writing this epistle. He's writing to the Romans. He's going to Rome, and if he doesn't make it, he wants to impart some spiritual gift, but if he can't impart that spiritual gift to them, then he wants to be able to tell them what the gospel is all about. And we'll pick it up now in Romans chapter 1 and verse 14. Paul says, I am a debtor both to the Greeks and to the barbarians, both to the wise and the unwise. So that as much as in me, I am ready to preach the gospel to you who are in Rome. Paul's purpose. And now verse 16. Now I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation for everyone who believes, for the Jew first and also the Greek. For in it, in this gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as is written, the just shall live by faith. Now, the book of Romans is about this concept of righteousness or justification. Now, when we talk about justification and righteousness, they're really two similar terms. Justification, if we want to say it simply, means to be just as if I never sinned. It's been totally just. I have done no wrong. And Paul says that it's the fact that we've done wrong that cuts us off from God. It's the whole message of the Bible. But now the gospel is the power of God unto salvation to everyone who believes. If I believe God, if I trust this gospel, if I trust in the work of Jesus Christ, if I trust that, then and believe that, then it'll be put to my account literally, or imputed to me, the Bible would say, for righteousness. So I become just or I become righteous by believing. We've always thought that we become righteous by what I do. If I do the right thing, I'll be righteous. But Paul says you can't do the right thing. His whole message is that you've got to trust in Jesus, who did the right thing, who died for you, and Christianity is exchange. He took our sin and we take his righteousness. And so we've got to believe in this good news, this gospel, that Jesus has taken our sin that we might have the righteousness of God. And now Paul begins to introduce this concept of the gospel. It is the power of God to everyone who believes. Doesn't matter who you are, whether you're as a Jew, as a Roman who would think that anyone who wasn't a Roman was a barbarian, to the wise, to the Greeks who thought themselves they had all the philosophers and wise people today. It doesn't matter whether you're one of those people or barbarian. It doesn't matter who you are. The gospel's for you. And so we're going to look at that now. And Paul now begins in Romans chapter 1, verse 18 through to verse 32. He begins with this whole concept of judgment. As I've said before, Romans is about doctrine. The doctrine of the gospel we've looked at, the doctrine of righteousness, the doctrine of faith, and we'll be talking about these things through them in the next 12 chapters and how we outwork this. But he starts off with this concept of judgment. And his thesis is very simple. He says everybody is under the judgment of God. And he gives a reason for it. So we'll look through here in this section of sin, which goes for 3.5 chapters. And he talks about how the sin, everybody is guilty. The whole world is guilty. It doesn't matter whether you're living in the jungles in some remote African place or whether you're living in the most sophisticated place in the Western world. Every person is guilty and is sinner, and he declares why now. Let's read it. Romans chapter 1 and verse 18. He said, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. Or verse 18, I should say, for this. He said, for the reason he's not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God, but he says, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven. Now, he said, the reason I'm not ashamed of the gospel is because God is angry with humanity. The wrath of God is revealed. God is revealing his wrath consistently. Well, how does he reveal his wrath? What is his wrath? It says, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness. Now, I used to have a phrase when I was doing Bible college, and I used to say, is your all, or is your all some? So he said, it's revealed against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth and unrighteousness. So he says God is angry with every person because we actually suppress truth. And he said, well, how do we suppress truth? Well, Paul goes on. And remember, Paul is a very logical teacher. He says, the reason God is angry and his wrath is upon us, what we would call judgment, he says it's because of this, verse 9, because that which be made known of God is manifest in them, for God is shown to them. So it says, for since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his power, eternal power and Godhead, so they are without excuse. So he's saying that if we look around, we'll see God. I mean, obviously, we look around, we can see God, and we must begin to worship this God as he is. But we look around and we can see God. But for instance, we'd have to look around and say, well, I can't see God, therefore he must be an invisible God. I look around and I see beauty. I see majestic mountains, wonderful seas. Nature has a breathtaking beauty about it. So God must be beautiful. He must love beauty. We look around and say, look, this world is complex. If you've ever tried to study science and figure out the complexities of science, you'd have to say, the creator of this world is wise. He understands deep things. You'd have to understand God is powerful. We can see a thunderstorm and a cyclone destroy things in a moment of time. We can see a tsunami, you name it. We can see the force of nature. So God is powerful because we can see this. So if God is an all-wise, He's powerful. God is a God of beauty. He's made human beings. One of the complex creatures of His creation. And so He says, but He said He said, since the creation, His invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead. But then the clincher is this. In verse 21, it says, because when they knew God, they did not glorify Him as God. And so the problem is, Paul goes on to explain here, and we'll look at it in the next session in more in depth, but he says the problem is, he says when people knew God, they didn't glorify Him as God, but they made Him less than God. In fact, they created a God in their image. He said people went around worshipping something that was carved out of a stick, a snake or something else, something less than God. He said the problem is, he says, let's read it again. He says, although they knew God, when they saw Him in nature, they did not glorify Him as God, nor were they thankful, but they became futile in their thoughts. They became, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became foolish, and they changed the glory of the incorruptible God into the image made like corruptible man, birds, four-footed animals, and creeping things. Therefore God gave them up. That's the wrath of God. He gave them up to uncleanness. And so He says, when they didn't know God, when they didn't worship God as God, they weren't thankful. He said, therefore God gave them up, and He changed their minds. In other words, the thought is what we worship, we become. And if we worship something that man's created, we become like that. Whereas if we worship God, we become like God. But because man hasn't worshipped God, and we worship Him as less than God, God's given it over. He said, well, if you like that, become like that. You'll become like that. And so what we worship has a big effect. The downward fall of God is to don't worship God as God. In other words, don't worship a God in His image, but worship in our image. And don't become thankful. So I guess we could say the way up, if we're a Christian, is to learn to be thankful and to worship God as God. It's two important keys in the Christian life. And if we don't do that, then we'll be in bondage. And we'll be looking at it in the next session. We'll be in bondage to our own sins, and that's the judgment of God. Let's look at that next section. Thank you for being with me in Video Bible College.